Good evening. Hello, everyone. My name is Victoria Williams. I am a program officer at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Thank you all for joining us this evening, despite the Chicago weather that we have today, for a talk on Trump, America First, and the World Order America Created. A huge thank you to our members in attendance today. Your support is critical to our work. If you are not yet a member, we ask you to consider joining us. We have a wide range of levels for you to choose from. For nearly a century, the Council has provided an independent and nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote a deeper global understanding and active U.S. engagement in the world. The views expressed by individuals we host are their own and do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. We ask you to please silence your cell phones, but not your voices. Know that we are on the record and that we are live streaming this event, but we do welcome your social media engagement on Twitter and Facebook. Later, we'll be taking audience questions from the room and also online. And if you'd like to submit your question online, you can go into your internet browser by typing in chi.cnf.io. And you can also vote for other people's questions. Before I turn it over to our speaker, a few brief words of introduction. Eliot Cohen is the Robert Osgood Professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He also directs the Strategic Studies program there. He has spent many years working in government and served in both departments in state and defense. He has authored numerous books, and his latest book, which is also for sale and for purchase and signing today, called The Big Stick, The Limit of Soft Power and Necessity of Military Force. And you can pick that copy up just after the program. So with that being said, I will return back to moderate Q&A, and please join me in welcoming our speaker, Eliot Cohen.
Thank you for that introduction. It's very good to be here to see family, old friends, even some former students. I have two rules about accepting requests to give speeches. One is if the United States military asks me to speak to them, I try to do it. And another, which is more recent, is that if a council like this one asks me to do it, I try to do it as well. I think for too long, discussions of the big issues of foreign policy were way too much confined to a few enclaves on the East Coast. And in a way, I believe that as a country, we're paying a price for that. We're paying a price, too, for ignoring some first-order questions about what the United States does in the world and why. And that's my topic tonight. I am going to talk about the Trump administration, of course, but I first want to spend some time talking about the American world order, the assumptions of which were given for me, as they were for Ambassador Dalder, throughout my entire career, and which have now been called into question. I'm going to talk about the price of America first, but to do that, I first have to talk about the alternative. That is, the world order that the United States and its allies built at the very end of World War II and immediately thereafter. Whether there is an American world order will determine the shape of future international politics. Whether we think there should be an American-shaped world order will determine not only what kind of military we have and how we use it, but much else besides. And if we do not, if this country chooses instead, in the long run, a policy of America first, the consequences will be profound. What was the American world order? Well, to begin at the beginning, let me just stipulate that the United States has always been globally engaged. I think there's sometimes a myth that the United States entered world politics in the 20th century. That's not true. I always tell my students that what we call World War II was actually World War VIII. The first really global war occurred at the end of the 17th century, and each of those world wars involved the United States, or what later became the United States. In fact, two of them, the 7 Years' War and the global war sparked by the American Revolution, began on this continent. Even in the earliest period, moreover, we see some constant themes in America's engagement in the world, and in particular, a very peculiar combination of ideals and interests. But it was not until the turn of the 20th century that politicians began to think about the United States playing a global role. The title of my book, which covers some of the material that I'm speaking about now, The Big Stick, is taken from a famous speech delivered by Theodore Roosevelt. Here's actually the most important part of that speech. It was given September 3rd, 1901, when he was still vice president, at the Minnesota State Fair. And he said the following: "We can be certain of one thing, whether we wish it or not. We cannot avoid hereafter having duties to do in the face of other nations. All that we can do is to settle whether we shall perform those duties well or ill." I think he very deliberately chose to give that speech in Minnesota, in the American heartland. 4 days later, President McKinley was shot. 2 weeks later, Theodore Roosevelt became president. Under him, the United States arbitrated the end of the Russo-Japanese War, projected power into the Pacific, warned the European powers off intervening in Latin America. Of course, it culminated at the end of his administration in painting a good chunk of the United States Navy white and sending it around the world to let people know the United States had arrived. Still, the United States was only one of the world's major powers. The American intervention in World War I marked a decisive commitment by the United States, and so too did America's role in shaping the post-war settlement. And that period left enormous legacies, including the rise of the United States to global financial and naval parity with Great Britain. But we can only begin to talk about a real American world order in the period that commenced at the end of World War II and the early Cold War. And in many respects, we are still living in the world that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Theodore's cousin, made. What were the core beliefs of FDR and his advisors? Together with the congressional leaders, some of them originally isolationists, of course, who had come around to his point of view. I think we can boil them down to 5 big ideas. The first is that totalitarianism, not state interests, not even a few evil individuals, but totalitarianism was the chief cause of the ruin of the Second World War. Secondly, that the totalitarian ideologies could only grow in the conditions of political and economic chaos that had resulted from the First World War, and from what Americans had come to think by the 1940s had been a poorly conceived settlement to that conflict, together with the economic divisions of the world in that period. Thirdly, the underlying reasons for that chaos, for the horrors of the First World War and its aftermath, was the unrestrained competition for power among the great empires before World War I, and, importantly, America's withdrawal from international politics afterwards. That is how FDR's generation viewed the repudiation of the League of Nations, American withdrawal into isolation and neutrality. And, by the way, the erection of high tariff barriers. Fourth, the generation that led this country in the 1940s all the way through the 1960s, and to some extent beyond, correctly believed that their war, World War II, was the most devastating conflict that had ever been experienced by humanity. Not only in the slaughter of innocents by the tens of millions, but the devastation of the core of the global economy and the invention of weapons which, if ever used in quantity, could quite literally bring the end of human civilization. Finally, they feared that that war would not necessarily be the last unless something were done about it, and that only the United States had the combination of wealth and power and ideological attraction to do something about it. Now, from those core beliefs came, in turn, a set of interrelated core remedies. The United States would have to accept for the indefinite future a position of international leadership. It would have to confront totalitarian ideologies and it would be inclined to see them, rather than nationalism or state interest, as the prime driver of international politics. The solution to economic chaos would have to be an open trading order rather than the division of the world into separate blocks. This also meant that maintaining such fundamental requirements as the freedom of the seas and a transparent and reliable international financial system. It meant as well the destruction of the European overseas empires, which were in any event tottering. The solution to the political chaos that that might cause would be an assertive American role and support, wherever possible, for representative government. Those solutions, in turn, required new, strong international institutions. This included international economic organizations, the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, created at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. Standing peacetime alliances and commitments, such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, created in 1949 in Washington, D.C. And of course, the United Nations itself. The phrase United Nations being technically the name of the anti-German and anti-Japanese alliance, created in 1945 in San Francisco. Note that all of these institutions were founded in the United States, and they were all led by the United States. And from 1945 onwards, the founding generation brooded over the problem of nuclear weapons. American leaders were not quite sure how to use them in international politics, but it soon became an article of faith that it would be essential to limit their spread and prevent their use. Cataclysmic war was a fearsome possibility. And so, above all else, the United States would have to be militarily very, very strong. These building blocks were new, and they were not inevitable. They required that the United States leave behind its aversion to permanent international arrangements, that it surrenders some elements of sovereignty, that it create large-standing military organizations in peacetime, which were traditionally viewed as a threat to liberty, that it would step away from the tariffs that had been a cornerstone of American economic policy since the early republic, and that the United States would have to think ideologically as well as pragmatically. Put together, and to oversimplify, this was the American world order. It did not cover the entire globe. The Soviet Union and its allies were out of it. It was not universally popular. Important neutrals like India did not like many of its implications. It was not entirely successful. New nuclear states continued to emerge. But it has proved astonishingly resilient and effective, and we need to remind ourselves of that. By some counts, there were something like 70 independent states in the world after the Second World War. Today, there are nearly 3 times as many. Real-world gross domestic product has grown by over an order of magnitude, a factor of roughly 20 in the years since the end of World War II. Even accounting for population growth, that is at least a quintupling of per capita GDP around the world. It's an amazing record. And it is made even more amazing by the way in which the subsequent struggle that helped shape that world order, the Cold War, ended on pretty peaceful terms, without the mass bloodshed that usually accompanies the disintegration of great empires. Now, I'm speaking very generally, of course. There were lots of reasons for these developments, but it's fair to say that American policy made this possible. The United States was willing to tolerate trade deficits in the early years of recovery from World War II. We were willing to maintain a vast military. We were willing to push and prod our allies into decolonization, but also to cushion their exit from empire. And let us remind ourselves that the United States has also benefited enormously from this world order. In the last 50 years alone, to be crude about it, American per capita gross domestic product has more than tripled. All very well, so why, in that case, is the question of the American world order now in play? Well, one answer has to do with the stretch that the United States is feeling. Global leadership was never easy, but it is, relatively speaking, more difficult than it was before. After the World War II, the United States accounted for over half of the global economy. That's a staggering statistic. Even in the mid-1960s, it was well over a third of it. Today, we're somewhere between a fifth and a quarter. And we are working from a more slender military base, from nearly half of the world's military spending in the 1960s through the 1980s to roughly a third today. Americans in general, it's fair to say, no longer always see the point of continuing to bear burdens on behalf of others, while they don't always see much payoff for themselves. And there's a further point. Much of the rationale for the American global position, and particularly its global military position, was cast in terms of the Cold War. When that conflict ended in 1989, there should have been a fundamental reconsideration of its premises, and that didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Well, the 1990s were what my late colleague Fuad Ajami once called the Great Picnic, during which being a superpower was cheap. Other countries paid for the first Gulf War. Actually, we made a modest profit on it. It cost us fewer than 150 soldiers killed in action. More were killed in accidents. The debate might have been triggered in the 2000s, but that instead was the era of what one might call the Great Emergency, following the 9/11 attacks. And so, in some ways, the debate is occurring now, with a president who is profoundly unattached to the previous world order. Today, in a world that is palpably more dangerous, there is in this country and abroad profound uncertainty about our role in the world, which has fed a variety of movements, to including some that are decidedly isolationist. So, we are now entering a watershed, a time of great debate, not always well conducted, but important nonetheless. As of now, the American world order still exists, but it is creaking. Instead of the totalitarianism of the early 20th century, we have other movements: religious fanaticism, nationalism, populism, all increasingly powerful, all, like totalitarianism what once was, at odds with liberal democracy as we have known it. We confront a rising China, a country whose economic dynamism matches and in some ways exceeds our own, while other states such as Russia and Iran are willing to use force to reshape the politics of their immediate regions. We have an economic order in which commitment to free trade on the part of the United States is decidedly weaker. But it's also fair to say that there are elements of the economic order that are simply less transparent and predictable than they once were, whether because of new mediums of exchange like Bitcoin, or the way in which money can pour in and out of countries at an astonishing speed. The end of empire has not brought stability in many parts of the world. And in fact, the artificiality and compromises required to create new states, such as Syria or Iraq or Yugoslavia, have led to further conflict, while secessionist movements have grown rather than shrunk in strength. Nuclear weapons have been limited by a variety of efforts, but as we see from the cases of North Korea and Iran, they are now spreading well beyond the great powers and reliable emerging powers like India and Israel. International institutions no longer have the vigor and moral authority they once had. Neither, more ominously, do many institutions that are indispensable to self-government and the rule of law. Into all of this, enter Donald Trump and America First. I'm told that Trump began using that term after David Sanger of the New York Times said after one of his interviews, "Wow, that sounds a lot like America First." Sanger is a well-educated journalist. He ought to be, since he was once one of my students. So he understood the historical reference. Trump, I think, almost assuredly knew little and cared less about the original America First movement, founded in September 1940, and which at its peak had over 800,000 members. Among its supporters were future presidents like John Kennedy and Gerald Ford, future intellectual figures like William F. Buckley and Gore Vidal, even a future Supreme Court Justice, Stuart Potter. Its purpose was pretty simple: to keep America out of the European war, including by enforcing legislation that would have made it essentially impossible to support Britain then fighting on its own against Hitler. Its national headquarters was, of course, right here in Chicago. Its chair was Robert E. Wood of Sears Roebuck. Its most eloquent spokesman was Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator. And perhaps not surprisingly, before very long, Lindbergh, if not always the entire movement, went into dark places, as when he declared in September 1941 that, of course, the Jews' greatest danger to this country lies in their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government. Pearl Harbor swept all that away. The experience was somewhat reminiscent of the infamous Oxford Union Resolution in 1933 to refuse to fight for king and country. Churchill says in his memoirs of that episode and that movement, "Little did the foolish boys who passed the resolution dream that they were destined quite soon to conquer or fall gloriously in the ensuing war. Less excuse can be found for their elders who had no chance of self-repudiation in action." And as we know, the Kennedys and the Fords and their classmates did the same. But America First did not die. It simply hibernated for a while, particularly after Dwight D. Eisenhower, a committed internationalist, defeated Robert Taft for the presidential nomination of the Republican Party in 1952. So what is contemporary America Firstism? When President Trump spoke at the United Nations in September 2017, it's very striking that he spoke about the objectives of the United States, of American foreign policy, as being prosperity, safety, and sovereignty. Not world order, not freedom, not human rights. Those remarks were prefigured and echoed by some of his key advisors. Trump is no ideologist. He's certainly no systematic thinker, although he has some strongly held views. For now, but only for now, he has relatively few sympathizers among prominent academics and journalists. He does have some, but most of them keep some kind of distance from an administration prone to outrageous statements and erratic behavior. In a similar vein, by the way, not to harp too much on the Chicago theme, Robert Maynard Hutchins, the famous president of the University of Chicago, sympathized with America First, but declined to join it. Perhaps the most recent summary of contemporary America Firstism can be found in an op-ed written by then National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster and then Director of the National Economic Council, Gary Cohen, in the May 31st, 2017 Wall Street Journal. They wrote, among other things, "The world is not a global community," in scare quotes, but an arena where nations, non-governmental actors, and businesses engage and compete for advantage. We bring to this forum unmatched military, political, economic, cultural, and moral strength. Rather than deny this elemental nature of international affairs, we embrace it. It is a vision of a dog-eat-dog world in which values like freedom of speech and freedom of religion are for Americans, and for others only if they so choose. For the rest, we recognize rivals, limited partnerships, and alliances of convenience only. The article, like President Trump's UN speech, was conspicuous in ignoring two words central to the American world order described above: values and institutions. And indeed, this administration has shown itself contemptuous of both. Kim Jong-un is honorable. Vladimir Putin is a killer, but so are we. Tayyip Erdogan is just fine. The United Nations is a problem. NATO is filled with a bunch of freeloaders. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was a lousy deal. The chancellor of a democratic Germany that so many Americans died to create is contemptibly weak. Like the original America First movement, Trump too would reject the Atlantic Charter, agreed to by FDR and Churchill in August 1941, which provided among its 8 principles a commitment to self-determination and to free choice of governments by the governed, free trade and freedom of the seas, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. America First reflects a relentlessly transactional approach to international politics, in which values are an inconvenience and institutions are a fraud. It has not been truly implemented because so few people in the administration, including, I believe, McMaster and Cohen, both of whom were subsequently fired, have actually adhered to. It is a pre-Rooseveltian view, not pre-Franklin Roosevelt, but pre-Theodore Roosevelt, who, as I've already pointed out, believed that the United States had international obligations and duties even before World War I. And that alone should make us realize how odd it is. And it will fail for at least 3 reasons. First, it both decries globalization, but in a certain way it neglects it. The United States cannot hide behind walls, which not coincidentally are an obsession of this administration. The world will come to us, as it did in one way on 9/11, and in another way through Russian interference in our election in 2016, and as it does in the myriad ways that foreign countries seek to shape our choices and our politics. Leon Trotsky once said, "You may not care about the dialectic, but the dialectic cares about you." Well, so too with America and the world. We may not care about the world, but the world cares and will always care about us. Secondly, it assumes that the United States can, in a sustained way, simply ignore its values. It cannot. We recently had a domestic demonstration of that, because if the United States could ignore its values, uniformed agents of the federal government would, even tonight, for all I know, be taking babies from their mothers. There's a reason why Abraham Lincoln cast the Civil War in universal terms, a test not of whether one part of the country could secede, but whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. There is intrinsically a universality about American values. That's how we were founded. It's in the Declaration of Independence. And that's why student demonstrators in Tiananmen Square, none of whom had been to the United States, in 1989 put up a papier-mâché model of, guess what? The Statue of Liberty. A values dimension is hardwired into American foreign policy. And that is why American micro-Metternichs and Tin Horn Talleyrand's are always frustrated. They wish it weren't so, but it is. That's not to say that American values and American interests always coincide, because they don't, or that they coexist easily, because often they do not. It's just that that dimension is there, and it's inescapable. Thirdly, without realizing it, America First is actually predicated on world order, on a belief that even if the United States confined itself to trade deals and limited partnerships in the world will somehow avoid the kinds of disruptions and wars that so profoundly shaped the short 20th century that lasted from 1914 to 1989. There is simply no reason to think that's true. What will happen if the United States fails to sustain the world order that it has created? Well, I think we begin to see the answer to that in places like Syria. More chaos and confrontation, not less. And I can think it can get a lot darker than that. My mother passed away 2 years ago. I often reflect on the world she knew and the world I have known. And I remember particularly vividly her talking of what it was like in the 1930s and 1940s, watching a world grow dark. Our notion of a world growing dark is 9/11. I believe that tragic as 9/11 was, it is nothing like as bad as it could be. if, for example, nuclear weapons were to be used in anger, or really large great power wars were to break out. And those things can happen. A new conception of the American role in the world is yet to be born. It will not simply be that of, let's say, the year 2000. Too much has happened, new powers are rising, we have suffered our own disappointments, amazing new technologies are disrupting our politics, our economics, and our societies. But I'm quite confident that it will emerge, hopefully without having to confront the disaster that a sustained period of America First could bring. Hammering out that conception is work that needs to begin now, in institutions like this, as well as at schools like my own. But we can say a few things. The first is that the United States continues to have, in absolute terms, a very good hand to play in international politics. It is, in relative terms, however, one that is increasingly challenged. There's nothing to beat the American alliance system. But alliances are, as George Shultz once said, like gardens. They need constant tending. The American military is the strongest on earth, but it is in some respects calcified, weakened as much as it has been strengthened by its vast experience of war in the last 17 years. The American economy is dynamic and still the most innovative on earth, and it is aided by the abundance of American energy and water resources. But it rests on an infrastructure of roads and railroads and airports that is increasingly inadequate. American demography is better than that of any other, most definitely including China, which people sometimes forget. But for a time, at least, that great American ability to integrate waves of aspiring newcomers, as my grandparents, all of whom were from rotten countries far away, is challenged. American research institutions are superb, but the freedom of thought and expression on our campuses is not what it once was. My bottom line is that our hand is relatively weaker than it once was. What is within our grasp is the opportunity to strengthen it again. So the challenges lie before us. Some parts are more manageable than others. The United States still has the leverage, should it choose to use it, to mold the international economic order, although our levels of debt and our unwillingness to endorse free trade as wholeheartedly as we once used to makes that more difficult. Strategically, the United States faces very different kinds of challenges: a rising China, a jihadist threat, dangerous states like Russia, Iran, and North Korea, and the problem of preserving the great commons, as the great theorist Alfred Thayer Mahan once called it, from outer space to cyberspace, from the Arctic to the high seas. None of these challenges are insuperable, but they require a kind of calculated statecraft and national consensus, both of which are now in danger. And it should be noted, too, that we have opportunities as well. Just think, for example, of the importance of the rise of a friendly great power like India, or the internal pressures that will be felt by countries like China and Russia. But if we fail to rise to that challenge, we risk a lot. I want to leave you with a quote from the great British writer George Orwell, from an article he published in 1940, just before the Germans overran France, in which he reflected back with a kind of stunned amazement on how much his world had changed in just a decade, since 1930. It is as though in the space of 10 years we had slid back into the Stone Age. Human types supposedly extinct for centuries, the dancing dervish, the robber chieftain, the grand inquisitor, have suddenly reappeared, not as inmates of lunatic asylums, but as the masters of the world. Things are not as bad now as they were in 1940 when he wrote those lines, but some of the trends are grim. We've had a pretty good time, all things considered. Most of us believe in some fashion in progress. Some of us have even believed in the end of history. I take a somewhat different view. I think we have been both more lucky and more skillful than we know in creating the preconditions for the freest, the most peaceful, and the most productive period in the history of humanity. The American world order is a large reason, and I would say the largest reason for why that happened. In early 1940, Churchill gave a speech in which he noted that there are, and I quote, thoughtless dilettanti or purblind worldlings who sometimes ask us, what is it that Britain and France are fighting for? To this I answer, if we left off fighting, you will soon find out. That, I think, is the right sentiment for the time. The great danger is that we may give up on the order that we have built to our own benefit and that of others before we have thought through an alternative, only to discover what it is that we have lost. And when we do discover it, it is likely that it will be, as Churchill warned, too late to recover. I hope it doesn't come to that. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Great. We'll open the floor to questions. If you can please wait for the microphone to come to you so we can capture your questions online. And please make sure that your question is a question. Great. We'll go up here right to the front.
First of all, thank you for a very provocative and excellent, if somewhat dark, talk. Here's my question. The world order that you refer to that's been created was created largely, as you point out, on the back of a very, very strong America. As one looks forward, and you mentioned China, you mentioned a growing India, and we can mention other countries as well, there's not going to be that margin of strength, and therefore, I have a hard time seeing another sort of world order without the concept of very strong alliances. And yet we're faced with a government that, among other things, disparage alliances, as you mentioned, very transactional. So how do we move past that point?
Well, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, you're right. I mean, even in 1945, it's not the case the United States simply had a concept that it imposed on everybody. We had very, very important partners, particularly in Europe, who, even if they didn't have anything like our resources, were nonetheless our partners, and we understood that we had to value that. I mean, now too, there are plenty of partners out there who are quite happy to work with us, but I guess my feeling is one of the challenges is to think about the new kinds of institutions we're going to need. You're not going to restore the United Nations to the moral authority that it had in the 50s and 60s. You might be able to revive NATO somewhat, although given the state of its expansion and its unwieldiness, I mean, I'll defer to Ambassador Dalder on NATO, but I think you'll have challenges there. But you had an opportunity with something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And we just threw it away. I will say that, you know, the Obama administration, I think, lost an opportunity to press real hard on that one early on. It kind of came around to TPP at the very end of the administration when it was too late, and that was a missed opportunity. And in general, I hope my remarks shouldn't be taken simply as an indictment of this administration, although, as you probably could tell, I don't have particularly warm feelings towards it. I think there have been a lot of ways in which the previous administration and the one before that, in which I served in the State Department, in a variety of ways, failed to see this coming. And were kind of lulled by the kind of easy supremacy of the 90s and early 2000s. So I think the way forward is absolutely that. It's going to be working on partnerships.
Great. We'll take a question just right here in the front. First of all, thank you very much. Wait for the microphone. Thank you.
To follow up on what you just said, could you talk a little bit more about what your vision of the U.S.-China relationship should be?
I think this is bound to be both the most important and the most difficult relationship that we're going to have. Because on the one hand, you know, we're clearly economically intertwined with them, A. B, it is, to my mind, a good thing that China has kind of risen out of poverty, just in terms of the amount of human misery on this planet. There's a lot to be said for that, and a certain kind of dynamism. On the other hand, this is a very hard authoritarian regime. They do, I think, want to push us out of East Asia. They are, I think, in some ways likely to become more willing to use force to get their way than they once were, and they're in a situation which is particularly unsettling in that it's become more of a dictatorship than it has been since the days of Mao. This is all centered in one man, and to the extent that one follows Chinese politics, you just see Xi Jinping has broken the norms that were established basically as the kind of Chinese leadership recovered from the turmoil of the Mao and immediate post-Mao period. And that, I think, is also intrinsically dangerous. So this is, like most I believe, like most challenges in foreign policy, you can manage them. You can't fix them. You can manage them, and it's going to have to be a combination of cooperation, but also strength, and above all, building a set of alliance relationships around it. Now, there again, I mean, there's actually a lot of quiet progress that was made in previous administrations, in the Obama administration, in the Bush administration, in terms of relationships with India, or the Indians and the Japanese, or the Japanese and the Australians. But I'll go again to that wonderful quote from George Shultz, also Chicago, I guess, about alliances being like gardening, that you have to tend them. And that's why the deeply transactional approach to international politics of this administration is so destructive. That's not how you build a real alliance. That's how you cut a deal, maybe, which is a very different thing.
Great. We'll take one just in the middle right here, gentlemen.
An excellent speech, but is Trump's policy on immigration leading to the radicalization of the nation of Mexico that's not being talked about by American leaders and foreign policy experts?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question, actually. Could you?
Is Trump's immigration policy leading to the radicalization of Mexico?
Oh, I think his, for sure, his rhetoric. I mean, set aside the policies from them, because actually the Obama administration had a fairly tough immigration policy too, but it was, in both the Obama and the Bush administrations, the overt rhetoric towards Mexico was generally friendly, neighborly rhetoric, as it should be. The United States is blessed by having two friendly neighbors, which is not true for most countries, if you think about it. And Trump's rhetoric has been, it's not hard. I mean, some of it has been downright, I think, racist, and it's certainly contemptuous. And most people are proud people. Mexicans are particularly proud people, and they do have very vivid memories of losing a good chunk of their country to us in the Mexican-American War. And it probably is leading, it's why they're going to have a pretty hard left government. So I think it's doing a lot of damage there. But it goes beyond this. I mean, I think his immigration, look, to some extent, there is a real issue. I mean, immigration is a real issue. Having legal immigration is a real issue. Any country should want to have control of its borders and not simply have completely unrestricted immigration on the one hand. But there are a couple of big buts. One, actually the most important of which is, and of course Trump being ignorant of American history doesn't realize this, if you go back to the Declaration of Independence, and which in my family we read aloud all of it on July 4th, including the boring parts, the Bill of Particulars, which I commend to you. One of the things in the Bill of Particulars is that King George is restricting immigration into these colonies. So I think he has no kind of visceral feeling for what immigration has meant to this country. But I think he also doesn't understand that the tide of immigration, it has something to do with the opportunities in the United States. It has a lot to do with the turmoil of Central America. And there again, I think one thing you can be critical of American foreign policy elites, and that goes for people like us. We tend to think a lot about Europe. We tend to think a lot about China and Japan. We tend not to think a whole lot about Central and Latin America, about this country's backyard. And to the extent that Central America is destabilized by internal violence, as well as by the tremendous demand for narcotics in the United States, you're going to have pressure from people wanting to move here. But yeah, I agree. He is causing a radicalization of Mexican politics. That's also not in our long-term interests. I mean, but for that matter, he's picking fights with Canada. I mean, really. Canada. By the way, my book before this was about how the United States spent 2 centuries fighting Canada, and each time we invaded them, we got whopped. But that's a different book.
Great. We have some questions coming in from online, and one of them is, this week the U.S. left the UN Human Rights Council, and how does this damage our reputation on the international stage?
Human Rights Council actually is, to my mind, it's been a pretty awful organization. Because the truth is you do have some of the world's greatest human rights abusers on it. And it is one monumental exercise in hypocrisy. Is it a good idea to leave it? Usually my view is you're better off being there and making a fuss all the time. But I find with myself, I have to periodically remind myself, just because it's somebody in the administration says it doesn't mean it's absolutely awful. And they're pointing to something real. And by the way, I think this is, look, part of the purchase that America First rhetoric has is because he's talking about some things which are real. So our NATO allies don't spend enough money on defense. They've never spent enough money on defense. That's part of, now, what he doesn't then, or the administration doesn't fully accept is, yeah, that's the way it always was. We kind of created that world, and we thought that that's a better world than having France and Germany periodically drag that continent into mammoth bloodshed, which, yeah, so to my mind, it's actually a pretty good deal. But he is touching true things. And that, by the way, of course, goes for globalization, I don't worry about losing my job to an immigrant from Honduras. That doesn't mean that there aren't an awful lot of Americans who do worry about losing their jobs to an immigrant from Honduras or to some factory in China. And I would be critical, again, of the foreign policy community for not being particularly sensitive to those kinds of things, because then you do open the way. He could not, this would not have the appeal that it does if he wasn't touching some things that are true.
Great. Gentleman right here in the middle. Thank you.
In your talk, you mentioned 2 American presidents who exhibited pretty dynamic leadership on the world stage, and that seems to be maybe necessary but insufficient, or at very least a really important condition for some of the opportunities that you cited and an ability to overcome some of the challenges that you mentioned in kind of getting back to some sort of role for America as a leader in the world. Given what appears to be a relatively total collapse of Republican opposition to the worldview of the president and what seems like either a shallow bench or a relatively weak bench on the party on the other side, what might we hope for in terms of dynamic leadership? And are there voices out there that you think we might look towards? And if not, how long will it take to find them?
Hope? Well, so I agree with you about the Republicans, unfortunately. I think while there's some Republican politicians who I think have been public in taking stands for, what I would consider solid views, not just on foreign policy, but on some other things. Truth is, the Republican Party has sort of become the party of Trump. And, just trying to speak as an observer rather than as, somebody who quit the party the week after the election, which I did, I find it hard to imagine it recovering and looking like the Republican Party that I belonged to in the 90s and the 2000s. I think those elements were always there, as I said. I mean, Taft was not Trump. Taft was a gentleman. Taft was somebody who believed profoundly in the Constitution and rule of law, and you know, he was a very serious figure. He may have been wrong, but he was an extremely serious and honorable and upright man. But I don't think the Republican Party will come back as the sort of internationalist alternative to the Democrats that it once was. With the Democrats, I mean, I know them less well. I think there are plenty of politicians who I think could do it, and they have, you know, between what their own side has and the kind of exiled foreign policy and national security elite of the Republican Party, which, you know, I'd like to think actually was sort of the most principled piece of the Republican Party, and that many of us took a very strong stand, you know, back in, actually all the way back in February and March of 2016, you know, they'll be able to put together an administration. And what you need in that case is a president. It's not that you need a president who is a kind of a master strategic thinker in their own right. You need somebody who has, above all else, character and good judgment. And then they can find smart and able, and they can hire it, because there's an abundance of smart and able. So the question is, can the Democrats produce somebody with good character and good judgment? And can they? For sure. Will they? I don't know. And of course, the other big question is, although the Democrats have not gone off the deep end in the way that I think the Republicans have, they have their own semi-isolationist wing. They have their own anti-free trade wing. So we're not safe there. I guess what strikes me about this moment, and in a way it's also just in general what strikes me about the United States, is it's just very unpredictable. I mean, I would not bet that there will only be two major parties 10 years from now. I mean, all my American political scientist friends say that it's impossible. But, you know, they were the same people who tell me Donald Trump would never be president, so why should I believe them? So I mean, I think we're in the middle of a big shaking up of our system. And I guess my bottom line would be this. I think, and maybe this just because it's of my views of this country, we will come through this, and we'll be okay, and our institutions will be strong, but we may be about to go through a period of a decade or so of real turmoil, some parts of which could be very dark, and it could be a little bit more or a little bit less. We'll be okay. What I worry about is, what is the world, once that's all done, we kind of pick ourselves up and dust ourselves off and look over the parapets, you know, what will be the world that we're looking at? That's what I worry about.
Great. We'll take a question up here, second row.
I would like to follow up on the comment you just made and have a question. With the weakness of both parties currently, the Democrats and the Republicans, and with emphasis on America first, by a president who says, I don't care about the world, I care about America first. What's the danger that democracy here will suffer, and specifically that the 2020 election may be postponed, or something like that can happen?
I don't think that will happen. I mean, I actually have a lot of faith in the fundamental institutions of American governance. And in fact, you know, the fact that the president has not been able to get many of the things that he wants are testimony to the fact that James Madison and his colleagues were actually pretty good constitutional architects, and that the things we care about remain intact. I mean, increasingly I've been doing a lot of speaking around the country, and I have no data for this, it's a feeling, but I think it's a pretty good feeling, that there's a lot of political energy out there. There are a lot of people who are engaged one way or another And that is going to make itself felt. I think it will make itself felt in 2018. I think it will make itself felt in 2020. I think we're in for a rough ride. I mean, if I had to bet, not that you can bet anything with confidence, I think there's a very good chance that he's going to fire Robert Mueller or Jeff Sessions or Rod Rosenstein, and that we will be in a full-blown constitutional crisis. But I lived through one of those before. You know, I remember Watergate. I will tell you what I told my students. So I teach at this place called the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. One of my students, and you guys in the back will get this, said, you know, we ought to have the school sweatshirt should say SICE in front and Deep State U on the back. Because we have so many students who go off into the Foreign Service and the intelligence community and the Defense Department. And yeah, it's an international school. We have many, many students from overseas, but there's all of that. But the day I was literally teaching the day after the election, and my students, who are not particularly partisan political, I would say, they're kind of like sort of center, some center, a little bit more center left than center right, but it's center. They were just stunned. They were just stunned and said, you know, so I got up and they said, Professor Cohen, you got to talk about this. So I said, okay, I'll talk about this. And I said two things. Remember the famous story that after the Constitutional Convention was finished, of course it had met in secret, Benjamin Franklin comes out of the hall and somebody in the crowd says, what kind of government have you given us, Dr. Franklin? And he says, a republic, if you can keep it. So the founders understood this was fragile. You know, Ronald Reagan once said, liberty is always one generation away from extinction. I said, here's the second thing. So my parents experienced the Great Depression and World War II and the Cold War and Joe McCarthy and the Korean War and the Vietnam War and the civil rights struggle and urban riots. And my grandparents, all of whom I knew quite well, experienced all those things, plus pogroms, World War I, and the influenza epidemic. So I said, who says you guys get off easy? And I think that is a very important perspective for people to bear in mind. This country has faced much worse things than this. I mean, this alarms me. You know, I lose sleep at night over it, literally. But collectively, we've faced much worse, and my parents and grandparents faced infinitely worse. So we'll get through it as long as we, you know, step up to the challenge.
Great. And I have one more question here. It comes from online, a little bit personal, but having a son in the military, has this altered your outlook on U.S. foreign policy?
So, just in case my daughter's watching, she's a naval officer. So I have a son in the military and a daughter. So it's Army and Navy, so it's joint. You know, I actually dealt with that a bit in an op-ed I wrote criticizing the Bush administration before I went into it during the Iraq War, which I supported, saying it didn't change my views of policy. It shortened my temper, made me less tolerant of incompetence and lack of seriousness. And that's very much how I feel. You know, my kids, I'm very proud of all my children. You know, they've all made their choices knowing what those choices mean. But I think when you're the parent of somebody who has volunteered to go into harm's way, you expect your country's leaders to be thoughtful and careful and responsible. I will say one other thing about that. You know, I published that op-ed in the Washington Post, Several months later, I was at Camp David with President Bush. A few months after that, I was in the Oval Office with President Bush. And a couple months after that, Secretary Rice swore me in as counselor of the Department of State. And it tells you something, not just about the Bush administration, but about what normal, decent political leadership looks like, which is it's magnanimous. It doesn't say you were critical of us, therefore we will have nothing to do with you. It is, if we think you can contribute, would you be willing to contribute? And we understand that you said some criticisms which we may not accept and we may not like, but you didn't do it in a mean or vindictive spirit. And I think that kind of largeness of spirit actually has characterized, I think, most of our administrations. And that's why, you know, I had a student who had retweeted something about this president a year before the election. He hadn't even said anything, he just retweeted it. And when they found out he was in the energy department, they kind of frog marched him out of there. I just said, this is so far out of the norms of what this country is, and it can't last.
That's all the time that we have. The bar will remain open, and the book is on sale.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen.